Death Valley is known for its extremes: endless distance, quiet heat, a landscape that feels empty, yet never truly still. Every year, people enter this place believing they understand it, believing preparation and experience are enough. Most leave without incident. A few do not. In late 1996, Paul Fugate arrived at Furnace Creek for what was meant to be a short visit. He checked in, he parked his car, and then he vanished. No trail, no confirmed direction, no clear explanation. What followed was not only a search of the desert, but a series of decisions that slowly turned a disappearance into a closed question. This documentary follows what happened after the searches ended, the records that were kept, the details that were never released, and the silence that settled in their place. Not to prove a theory, but to understand how a person can disappear and how an unanswered case is allowed to remain unanswered. The disappearance at Furnace Creek. Paul Fugate arrived in Death Valley in the last week of November 1996. He was 43 years old, a resident of San Diego, and an experienced solo traveler. His plan was modest. He told co-workers he intended to spend several days photographing desert landscapes and abandoned mining structures before returning home. His car, a white 1992 Ford Taurus, entered Death Valley National Park on November 26, according to entrance records later reviewed by investigators. The park was quiet at that time of year. Thanksgiving crowds had passed, daytime temperatures were mild, and nights dropped sharply after sunset. Rangers logged normal activity. No weather warnings were posted. Roads were open. Nothing in the records suggested heightened risk. Fugate checked into the Furnace Creek campground late that afternoon. A receipt later recovered from his vehicle showed a single night fee paid in cash. The handwriting on the permit matched his driver's license signature. He was seen briefly by another camper who recalled a man unloading a camera bag and a small backpack. The interaction lasted less than a minute. No conversation was remembered. The next morning, November 27, Fugate was no longer at his site. His tent remained packed inside his car. His sleeping bag had not been unrolled. His cooler was unopened. Rangers initially assumed he had left early to explore nearby trails or viewpoints. This was common. Solo visitors often moved without notifying staff. By midday, the vehicle was still there. Park employees noted it during routine rounds. The keys were not visible. The doors were unlocked. Nothing appeared disturbed. His wallet was inside the glove compartment. Cash was still present. There were no signs of theft or forced entry. A ranger made a note in the log, but took no action. Unattended vehicles were not unusual, especially during short hikes. The park's internal guidance at the time did not require immediate intervention unless other risk indicators were present. On November 28, the car had not moved. A second ranger documented the same observations. The area around Furnace Creek showed no fresh footprints leading away from the campground. Wind had erased older tracks. The ground was dry and compacted. By November 29, Fugate was officially listed as missing. A preliminary search was initiated within a limited radius of the campground. Rangers walked short loops along established paths and road shoulders. No equipment beyond binoculars and radios was used. No canine units were requested. No aircraft were deployed. Park records show the search was paused after several hours due to lack of indicators. The report used the phrase, "voluntary absence remains possible." This classification allowed the incident to remain low priority. Family members were notified on December 1 after Fugate failed to return to work. His sister contacted the park directly. She later stated that staff seemed unsure about the status of the search. She was told that Death Valley was large and that many visitors underestimated its scale. On December 3, a more formal search began. This time, teams expanded beyond Furnace Creek. Helicopter overflights were conducted along nearby washes and canyon mouths. Rangers scanned for reflective surfaces or color contrasts. Nothing was found. The terrain surrounding Furnace Creek is deceptive. It appears open and navigable from a distance. In reality, it is cut by shallow ravines, salt flats, and rocky outcrops that limit visibility. Sound does not travel well. Orientation can shift quickly without clear landmarks. Despite this, Fugate's absence raised questions. He had not packed for extended hiking. His water containers remained full. His camera equipment was still in the trunk. Nothing suggested a planned excursion into remote backcountry. On December 6, search efforts were scaled back again. The official reason cited resource constraints and the absence of physical evidence. The case was reclassified as suspended pending new information. Over the following weeks, rumors began circulating among park visitors and online forums. Some claimed Fugate had been seen arguing with a ranger. Others suggested he had accessed a restricted area. None of these claims appeared in official reports. In January 1997, Fugate's car was towed from the campground. The inventory list noted no damage. A roll of undeveloped film was found in the center console. It was logged, but never publicly released. Requests by the family to view its contents were denied, citing chain of custody concerns. This decision would later become a focal point of suspicion. The film was never introduced as evidence of criminal activity, nor was it described in detail. Park statements referred to it only as non-probative. In February, a hiker reported finding a shoe several miles south of Furnace Creek, near an unmarked wash. Rangers examined the item and concluded it did not match Fugate's footwear. The shoe was left at the site. No further action was taken. In March, a maintenance worker reported an unusual odor near a culvert off Badwater Road. The area was checked and cleared. No remains were found. The incident did not appear in the public incident log. By April, the case had gone quiet. Official communications ceased. Fugate's family continued to request updates, but received standardized responses. The park maintained that extensive searches had been conducted and that no evidence of foul play existed. Years later, former park employees would speak informally about the case. Some described it as uncomfortable. Others said it was handled by the book. One retired ranger, speaking anonymously, stated that there were things we were told not to speculate about. No documentation supports claims of direct involvement by the National Park Service. No arrest records, disciplinary actions, or internal investigations have ever been released. At the same time, no clear explanation has been provided for Fugate's disappearance. The physical facts remain limited. A vehicle left behind, personal items untouched. A man experienced enough to know basic desert safety, gone without trace. The absence of evidence became the defining feature of the case. Death Valley continues to receive millions of visitors each year. The landscape has not changed. Trails remain open. Furnace Creek remains active. Fugate's name appears only in archived missing persons listings and occasional online discussions. The park's position has remained consistent. There is no indication of murder. There is no indication of staff misconduct. The case is categorized as unresolved due to environmental factors. Yet questions persist, not because of what is known, but because of what is missing. Records that were never released. Decisions that were never explained. Searches that ended without conclusion. Paul Fugate entered Death Valley under clear skies. His departure was never recorded. Early search decisions and quiet limitations. The first decisions made after a disappearance often shape everything that follows. In Paul Fugate's case, those decisions occurred slowly and with little urgency. Death Valley National Park relied on a tiered response system in the mid-1990 seconds, one that emphasized visible danger before escalation. Without signs of injury, distress, or abandoned survival gear, missing adults were frequently treated as delayed travelers rather than endangered persons. On the 27th of November 1996, the day Fugate was first noticed absent, the assumption was routine movement. Rangers recorded that solo visitors often left campgrounds before dawn to avoid heat or to reach overlooks during early light. This expectation reduced concern. No attempt was made to locate Fugate by radio or public address. His name was not broadcast to nearby ranger stations. The second day followed a similar pattern. The vehicle remained parked. Personal items remained inside. Rangers documented the situation but did not seal the area. Other campers continued to come and go. Tire tracks accumulated. Footprints overlapped. Whatever trace might have existed was gradually erased. Search protocol at the time required trigger indicators before a full response. These included extreme weather, medical alerts, known mental health concerns, or evidence of forced abandonment. None applied to Fugate based on the information available. His permit listed no emergency contact beyond a home address. He had not filed a hiking plan. He had not checked in with a visitor center. When Fugate was officially declared missing on November 29, the delay had already narrowed options. Initial search zones were calculated based on average walking distance over time. Rangers estimated a radius of 2 to 3 miles from Furnace Creek. This estimate assumed level terrain and linear movement. It did not account for confusion, backtracking, or diversion into washes. The search teams that day consisted of on-duty rangers reassigned temporarily. No external volunteers were requested. No interagency coordination was initiated. The search was described internally as exploratory. Documentation shows that it lasted under 6 hours. The landscape around Furnace Creek creates visual certainty where none exists. Wide salt flats suggest openness. In practice, low ridges and shallow depressions block sightlines. A person can move a short distance and disappear from view entirely. Without aerial support, ground searches rely on chance alignment. Helicopter use was discussed but deferred. The cost was cited. Weather conditions were deemed acceptable but not urgent. At that stage, there was no confirmation Fugate was in danger. Park guidance emphasized conservation of resources. On December 1, when Fugate's family contacted the park, internal notes show a shift in tone. The case status was updated from delayed visitor to missing person. This change allowed for expanded search authority, but it did not automatically trigger it. Approval was still required at higher levels. The expanded search on December 3 included helicopter sweeps along roads and known walking routes. The flight paths were limited. Pilots focused on open areas where a body or reflective object might be visible. Washes with heavy shadow were passed quickly. Rocky sections were avoided due to rotor wash concerns. Search dogs were considered and rejected. The justification cited heat degradation of scent and time elapsed. Records show that no attempt was made to test scent viability using Fugate's personal items, even though those items were accessible. The concept of probability of detection guided decisions. Areas closest to the campground were searched first. As no evidence was found, perceived probability decreased. This created a feedback loop. Lower probability justified reduced effort, which in turn ensured no new evidence would emerge. Throughout the process, documentation remained sparse. Daily logs referenced negative findings without detail. Search grids were not publicly archived. Maps were not released. When family members later requested specifics, they were told records were incomplete. A notable omission was the lack of water source checks. Death Valley has few permanent water points, but visitors often gravitate toward known springs and seeps. Search teams did not prioritize these areas initially. By the time they were reviewed, weeks had passed. Another limitation involved assumptions about experience. Fugate was described in reports as outdoors capable. This label reduced perceived risk. Experienced visitors were expected to self-rescue or avoid hazardous movement. This assumption appears repeatedly in park incident analyses from the era. Yet Fugate's equipment contradicted the idea of a long excursion. His water supply remained unused. His camera gear remained in the vehicle. He carried no overnight pack. These details were noted, but not integrated into search modeling. By December 6, administrative pressure influenced the case. Search operations disrupt routine park functions. Staff overtime increases. Equipment is diverted. With no findings, leadership authorized suspension. The language used was procedural, not emotional. The search was paused. The pause became permanent. There was no scheduled reassessment. No threshold for reactivation was defined. The case entered a category that relied on external discovery rather than proactive effort. In the months that followed, the park responded to inquiries with consistent phrasing. Extensive searches had been conducted. No evidence of foul play existed. Environmental exposure was the most likely explanation. Internally, however, some staff questioned the early limitations. Later training materials referenced the case indirectly, emphasizing faster escalation. Fugate's name was not included, but the circumstances were recognizable to those familiar with the incident. The absence of a body complicated classification. Without remains, the cause of disappearance remained theoretical. Exposure, accident, suicide, or third-party involvement all remained possible. None could be confirmed. This uncertainty created administrative comfort. Uncertainty requires no resolution. It allows closure without answers. Years later, when comparisons were drawn to other disappearances, Fugate's case stood out not for unusual terrain or weather, but for its procedural quiet. Nothing dramatic occurred. No alarm sounded. No mistake was acknowledged. The early days passed without urgency. The ground changed. The record thinned. Possibility narrowed. What remained was a sequence of reasonable decisions that collectively ensured nothing would be found. Evidence that stayed behind. When a person disappears without witnesses, objects take on greater weight. In Paul Fugate's case, nearly everything connected to him stayed in one place. His vehicle became the primary source of information. It did not move after the 26th of November 1996. It was not tampered with. It did not show signs of hurried departure. What it contained, and what it did not, shaped the investigation more than any search effort. The white Ford Taurus was parked nose-in at the edge of the Furnace Creek campground. Rangers photographed it on November 29, after Fugate was listed as missing. The photos show the car sitting evenly, tyres properly inflated, no fluid leaks visible beneath. The hood was cool to the touch. The engine had not been recently run. Inside the vehicle, the arrangement was ordinary. The driver's seat was positioned for a single occupant. The rear seats were empty. The trunk contained a small hard-shell camera case, a folded tripod, and a duffel bag with clothing. None of the items were scattered. Nothing appeared rummaged. The glove compartment held Fugate's wallet. His driver's license, credit cards, and cash were still inside. Investigators later stated that this fact argued against voluntary disappearance. It also argued against robbery. The money amount was never publicly disclosed, only that it was consistent with normal travel. A cooler sat behind the passenger seat. It contained unopened bottled water and packaged food. No containers were missing. No wrappers were present. The food was not expired. This detail was noted repeatedly in reports, yet it produced no change in search strategy. The ignition keys were not found in the car. Their absence was treated as expected. If Fugate had left the vehicle, he would have taken them. No spare key was located. This meant the vehicle could not be started without towing, which later required forced access. One of the more unusual items documented was a roll of undeveloped 35mm film. It was found in the center console, not inside the camera. The camera itself was in the trunk, unused. Investigators logged the film as evidence and removed it during the vehicle inventory in January 1997. What the film contained has never been disclosed. Park officials stated only that it was developed and reviewed. They did not specify how many frames were exposed or what subjects were visible. The family was told that the images were not relevant. No copies were released. This decision raised quiet concern, even among some staff. Film represents a record of where a person was and what they noticed. In a disappearance, it can provide a timeline or direction of travel. In Fugate's case, that potential record disappeared into administrative storage. Another detail involved footwear. Fugate's hiking boots were not in the car. Rangers inferred he had worn them when he left. Later reports stated that this suggested intentional movement rather than accident near the vehicle. No comparison was made between the boots and any impressions found during searches. The absence of maps also drew attention. No trail maps were found inside the car. No guidebooks. No handwritten notes. Fugate appeared to be relying on familiarity or improvisation. This contradicted the idea of a planned long hike, but the contradiction was not resolved. His phone was not present. In 1996, mobile phones were less common, but Fugate reportedly owned one. Whether he carried it that day remains unknown. No phone records were obtained. Cellular coverage in Death Valley at the time was minimal, and this fact appears to have discouraged further inquiry. No blood, hair, or torn fabric was found in or around the vehicle. This absence was used to rule out violence near the campsite. The surrounding ground, however, had been disturbed by multiple days of foot traffic before any formal perimeter was established. When the car was towed, the inventory process was routine. Items were listed, photos were taken, the vehicle was impounded and later released to the family. No forensic laboratory analysis was performed. No trace evidence was collected. The lack of forensic work was consistent with the case classification. Without evidence of a crime, the incident remained a missing person investigation. Resources allocated reflected that status. Still, the static nature of Fugate's belongings stood in contrast to the narrative of environmental exposure. Exposure cases typically show partial preparation, extra water taken, gear rearranged, clothing removed or added. Fugate's equipment remained untouched. The undeveloped film continued to attract speculation. Some wondered if it contained images of restricted areas or sensitive infrastructure. Others suggested it showed something unrelated but troubling. There is no documentation supporting either idea. The silence itself became the issue. In later correspondence, park officials emphasized privacy concerns. They stated that releasing the film would violate internal policy. This explanation satisfied administrative requirements, but did little to address family questions. Over time, the physical evidence froze the case. No new items emerged, no clothing was found, no equipment surfaced. The absence of secondary discovery prevented re-evaluation. Years later, Comparisons were made to other cases where personal effects were left behind. In those cases, investigators often revisited evidence as technology improved. Fugate's case did not receive such review. The film was never re-examined publicly. The vehicle was not retested. What remained was a closed circle of objects: a car that did not move, food that was not eaten, money that was not spent, a camera that was not used, a roll of film that was seen and then withheld. In missing person cases, evidence usually points outward. Here, it pointed nowhere. It stayed still. This stillness became part of the explanation. With no disturbance, no struggle, and no trail, the disappearance was attributed to the landscape. The desert was said to erase people, yet deserts do not remove keys from pockets or leave supplies unused. They do not store film quietly or deny its contents. The evidence that stayed behind did not explain what happened. It explained only that something interrupted normal behavior. That interruption remains undocumented: administrative silence and withheld records. After search activity slowed, the case moved from the field into offices. This transition changed how information was handled. Decisions were no longer shaped by terrain or daylight, but by forms, policies, and internal thresholds. In Paul Fugate's case, this shift marked the beginning of a quieter disappearance, one that occurred on paper. By January 1997, responsibility for the case rested with park administration rather than search coordinators. Communication with the family became formal. Responses were written. Phone calls were summarized in brief notes. Language grew standardized. The tone moved away from uncertainty and toward closure. The National Park Service maintained that all relevant procedures had been followed. Requests for additional searches were declined. The reason given was consistent. No new evidence justified renewed effort. Environmental exposure remained the working explanation. Fugate's sister submitted multiple written requests asking for copies of incident reports, search maps, and ranger logs. Some documents were provided in redacted form. Others were denied outright. The denials cited internal deliberative privilege and law enforcement sensitivity, even though no criminal investigation was open. One of the first withheld items was the complete search log. The family received summaries, but not daily, operational notes. These notes would have shown who searched where, for how long, and under what assumptions. Without them, it was impossible to reconstruct the scope of the effort. Another withheld category involved internal email communication. In the mid-1990 seconds, email use within the Park Service was expanding but not yet standardized. Officials stated that relevant emails either did not exist or were not retained. No audit was conducted to verify this claim. The undeveloped film appeared again in correspondence. The family requested copies of the photographs, or at least a written description. The park responded that the images contained nothing of evidentiary value and were therefore exempt from disclosure. No statute was cited, no appeal mechanism was offered. Freedom of Information Act requests followed. Some were partially fulfilled, others were delayed beyond statutory timelines. When documents arrived, they often referenced attachments that were missing. Inquiries about those attachments went unanswered. The language used in responses followed a pattern. Phrases like, "to the best of our knowledge," "no indication," and "records not located" appeared frequently. These phrases are common in administrative correspondence. They protect agencies from definitive statements. Former employees later described a culture of caution. Missing person cases that did not generate media attention were managed quietly. Documentation was minimal. The goal was resolution without escalation. In Fugate's case, this approach meant that unanswered questions accumulated without challenge. No external review board examined the file. No independent agency assessed the search decisions. The case remained internal. When comparisons were made to other disappearances, park officials emphasized scale. Death Valley was vast. Recovery was difficult. Many cases ended without remains. This framing normalized the outcome. What it did not address was the absence of transparency. Families of missing persons often rely on records to understand what was done. In this case, the record was incomplete by design. The administrative silence extended to interagency communication. Local law enforcement deferred to the Park Service. The Park Service maintained jurisdiction. No handoff occurred. This kept the case contained. Over time, institutional memory faded. Staff rotated. Retirements occurred. New employees were unfamiliar with the details. When asked years later, some could recall the name, but not the circumstances. This loss of continuity further reduced the chance of review. Without an advocate inside the system, the case remained static. The withheld records did not prove wrongdoing. They did not confirm misconduct. They simply prevented scrutiny. Silence became the default response. In disappearance cases, transparency often invites speculation. Silence invites more. In Fugate's case, speculation filled the gaps left by paperwork that never surfaced. The administrative process did not resolve the disappearance. It archived it. Patterns in other park disappearances. When a single case lacks resolution, comparison becomes a method. Investigators and administrators look outward not to assign cause, but to establish context. In the years surrounding Paul Fugate's disappearance, several similar incidents occurred across the national park system, each unfolded differently. Yet, when reviewed together, shared patterns emerged in how they were managed, documented, and eventually set aside. These cases rarely began with alarm. In most, a vehicle was found first. It was parked legally. It showed no signs of damage. Personal items remained inside. The absence of immediate distress delayed escalation. Rangers assumed temporary absence. Time passed quietly. In Yosemite National Park in 1994, a middle-aged hiker named Mark Peterson failed to return from a short walk near Tuolumne Meadows. His car was located within hours. Like Fugate's, it contained food, clothing, and personal documents. Search efforts were initiated the next day, not the same evening. Peterson was never found. In Great Basin National Park in 1995, a solo visitor disappeared after checking in at a campground and leaving no itinerary. His vehicle remained at the site for 3 days before being flagged. The search focused on nearby trails and stopped after a week. The official explanation cited terrain complexity and weather exposure. These cases shared a structural similarity. None involved immediate witnesses, none involved obvious criminal indicators, none triggered outside law enforcement leadership. Each remained under park jurisdiction from start to finish. In reports, the language used to describe these incidents followed a consistent form. The missing person was experienced. Conditions were challenging but manageable. Searches were described as extensive, though specifics were rarely detailed. The phrase, "no evidence of foul play," appeared frequently. This language did not assert conclusions. It framed absence as environmental outcome. The park became both the setting and the explanation. Another recurring feature was the treatment of personal effects. Items left behind were inventoried, photographed, and stored. In some cases, cameras, notebooks, or recording devices were recovered. Their contents were reviewed internally. Families were rarely given full access. Decisions were justified through privacy or relevance policies. The withholding of materials was not unique to Fugate's case. In Sequoia National Park in 1997, undeveloped film belonging to a missing photographer was logged and never released. Officials stated that the images did not aid the investigation. The family was told the same. Search timelines also showed alignment. Initial efforts were localized. Expansion depended on early findings. When none appeared, operations slowed. Resource allocation followed probability models that favored closure over persistence. These models assumed linear movement. They did not easily accommodate erratic behavior, disorientation, or third-party involvement. When assumptions failed, the search ended rather than adapted. Administrative response patterns reinforced this outcome. Once a case entered suspended status, reactivation required new evidence. New evidence rarely emerged without active searching. This circular requirement ensured stasis. In each case, record-keeping grew thinner over time. Early logs were detailed. Later correspondence became brief. Eventually, communication ceased. The case was not closed. It was archived. Park officials often emphasize scale when asked about these outcomes. National parks cover vast areas. Search success rates decline rapidly after the first days. This explanation was accurate but incomplete. It described physical limitation, not procedural choice. Another pattern involved jurisdictional containment. Local sheriff departments deferred to the Park Service. Federal oversight was limited. Without criminal indicators, no external review occurred. This kept investigations insular. When families pressed for answers, responses followed policy. They did not engage speculation. They did not acknowledge uncertainty beyond general statements. The absence of engagement was consistent across cases. Former rangers later described a culture shaped by caution. Escalation brought scrutiny. Scrutiny brought paperwork. Without clear cause, restraint was preferred. This approach reduced error risk, but also reduced discovery. In internal training documents from the late 1992s, missing person cases were referenced indirectly. The emphasis was on early assessment and visitor education. Past cases were anonymized. Lessons were abstracted. Names were removed. This anonymization protected privacy, but also erased narrative continuity. Each disappearance became an isolated event rather than part of a pattern. Public awareness varied. Some cases attracted media attention, others did not. Those that did received temporary focus, those that did not remained unknown. Fugate's case fell into the latter category. The lack of media pressure influenced administrative posture. Without external inquiry, internal processes proceeded without challenge. Decisions were final by default. Across these cases, no evidence emerged to confirm institutional wrongdoing. At the same time, no mechanism existed to evaluate institutional blind spots. The absence of review became a feature, not a flaw. Patterns do not prove intent. They indicate habit. In the National Park Service, habit favored environmental explanation, procedural closure, and record limitation. Paul Fugate's disappearance aligned with these habits. His case did not stand out in process. It stood out only in persistence. The repetition across parks suggested a system optimized for management rather than resolution. Disappearances were categorized, not investigated beyond defined thresholds. This system did not create disappearance. It shaped response. Understanding that response requires looking not at one case, but at many. The question of restricted areas. National parks are presented as open spaces, but access is not uniform. Large portions of Death Valley National Park are designated as restricted, limited, or administratively controlled. These areas exist for many reasons. Some protect fragile ecosystems, others contain abandoned infrastructure, unstable terrain, or historical remnants not intended for public contact. Still, others are closed for reasons not explained on signage. In official maps available to visitors in 1996, restricted areas were minimally marked. Boundaries were often implied rather than defined. Small notices warned against entry, but did not describe consequences beyond safety concerns. Rangers relied on compliance rather than enforcement. Paul Fugate's campsite at Furnace Creek was within a corridor that bordered multiple limited access zones. Old service roads branched away from the main area. Some led to utility installations. Others ended at abandoned structures from earlier mining or military use. These routes were not highlighted in visitor materials. Park policy at the time allowed rangers to issue citations for unauthorized entry. It also allowed for discretionary handling when visitors wandered unintentionally. In most cases, individuals were redirected without penalty. Incidents were logged briefly, if at all. In Fugate's case, rumors later suggested he may have entered an area marked for staff use only. No citation was issued. No incident report documenting such an interaction has ever been released. Officially, there is no record that Fugate violated any access rule. The absence of a record does not confirm the absence of an event. In the 1,990 seconds, many ranger interactions were resolved verbally. Documentation was reserved for escalations. A brief warning would not necessarily appear in logs. Some former visitors recalled that boundaries around Furnace Creek were unclear, fences were intermittent, signs weathered, paths crossed without obvious transition. A person walking with a camera could move from public space into controlled space without noticing. Restricted areas also complicate search operations. When a person goes missing near such zones, search authority changes. Certain locations require additional clearance. Some require escorts. Others are excluded entirely unless a specific threat is identified. Park officials have stated that all accessible areas were searched during Fugate's disappearance. They have not specified whether restricted zones were included. Requests for clarification have not been answered directly. In internal guidance documents, restricted areas are often described as non-probable travel zones for visitors. This classification lowers search priority. The assumption is that visitors do not enter these spaces without intent. When intent is unclear, probability remains low. This assumption can fail when boundaries are porous. A person unfamiliar with administrative designations may wander into a closed wash or service road without awareness. Once inside, visibility drops. Movement becomes difficult to track. Some restricted zones contain hazards not immediately visible: unstable ground, open shafts, old culverts, maintenance tunnels. These features are known to staff, but not marked for public awareness. Entry is discouraged precisely because rescue is difficult. there is no evidence that Fugate accessed such a hazard. There is also no documentation confirming he did not. The lack of search transparency leaves the question open. In other parks, restricted areas have been involved in disappearances. In Joshua Tree National Park, several missing persons cases occurred near closed mine sites. In those cases, later discoveries revealed remains in zones not initially searched due to access limitations. These precedents raised questions about whether similar blind spots existed in Death Valley. Officials responded by emphasizing that Fugate's disappearance showed no indicators of such movement. The statement relied on absence rather than confirmation. Another dimension involves enforcement authority. Rangers encountering a visitor in a restricted area may escort them out. This interaction could involve transport, temporary detention, or confiscation of items. Policy allows these actions under certain conditions. No evidence suggests Fugate was detained, no logs indicate escort or transport, no vehicle movement was recorded. These facts argue against formal enforcement, yet informal correction leaves little trace. A ranger could instruct a visitor to leave an area without documentation. If the visitor refused or became disoriented afterward, the interaction might not appear in records. This possibility remains speculative. It persists because documentation is incomplete. The park's position is that speculation is not evidence. That position is procedurally sound. Restricted areas also intersect with another issue: jurisdictional overlap. Some closed zones fall under shared control with other federal agencies. Access rules differ. Disclosure rules differ. Search authority can be fragmented. Death Valley includes areas historically used by the military and other agencies. Some remnants remain. Their current status is not always visible. Information about them is limited. Park officials have stated that no such installations were relevant to Fugate's case. They have not released supporting documentation. The assertion stands alone. The question of restricted areas persists not because of proof, but because of uncertainty. When a person disappears near boundaries that are not clearly mapped or searched, uncertainty expands. In Fugate's case, that uncertainty was never resolved. The search did not publicly confirm inclusion or exclusion. Administrative responses avoided specificity. Over time, the question faded from official discussion, yet it remains in informal discourse. Visitors continue to ask how much of the park is truly accessible. Families of missing persons ask where searches actually went. Restricted areas are meant to limit risk. In some cases, they limit knowledge instead. Paul Fugate's disappearance occurred in a place defined by openness and constraint at the same time. The map available to him was simpler than the one used by administrators. What lies beyond those lines remains unexamined. Witnesses, statements, and what was not recorded. Time is the most fragile element in a disappearance. In the earliest hours, observation still has texture. Details remain ordinary rather than significant. People remember what they saw, without knowing it might later matter. As time passes, memory reorganizes itself. What felt unimportant fades first. In Paul Fugate's case, that quiet erosion began before anyone realized a record was needed. Furnace Creek Campground in late November operated at low capacity. Seasonal traffic had declined. Visitor permits show fewer than 30 occupied sites on the evening Fugate arrived. This limited the number of potential witnesses, but it did not eliminate them. People were present. They moved through shared space. They noticed one another in passing. Most of those observations never became statements. They existed only as passing awareness. A car arriving, a man unloading equipment, someone walking alone toward the edge of light. These moments did not register as events. They were absorbed into the background rhythm of the campground. One camper later recalled seeing a man near a white sedan during the late afternoon of November 26. The man appeared organized and unhurried. He removed items from the trunk and placed them neatly inside the vehicle. There was no visible distress, no raised voice, no interaction. The camper assumed the man was settling in briefly before sunset. This recollection was shared verbally with a ranger after Fugate was declared missing. It was not written down. Another visitor, interviewed years later in an unrelated context, described remembering a figure with a camera walking eastward toward a low ridge as the sun dropped. The memory was anchored not to the person's face, but to the light. The sky was shifting color, shadows stretched across the ground, silhouettes were sharp. The visitor remembered direction more than identity. This observation was never formally collected during the investigation. Rangers on duty the following day noted no disturbances. Patrol logs from November 27 describe routine checks. Campgrounds were quiet, No complaints were logged, no reports of arguments, injuries, or unusual behavior were received. This absence was taken at face value. If nothing was reported, nothing was assumed to have occurred. Silence, however, does not always indicate uneventful conditions. Visitors often hesitate to report vague impressions. They are uncertain whether what they noticed is meaningful. A person walking alone does not seem noteworthy in a national park. A parked car does not raise concern. Relevance is assigned later, after disappearance reframes memory. By the time Fugate was officially listed as missing on November 29, the campground population had turned over. Most visitors from earlier in the week had already left. Their permits remained on file, but no effort was made to contact them. Park procedure did not require retroactive witness canvassing unless evidence of a crime existed. This procedural threshold shaped the record. Because no criminal indicators were present, witness outreach remained minimal. Potential observations were allowed to dissipate naturally. What remained were only those memories strong enough to surface without prompting. Staff at the Furnace Creek Visitor Center represented another group of potential witnesses. Records indicate that Fugate did not request maps, attend ranger talks, or ask for guidance. This suggests either confidence or disinterest. Visitor Center employees later stated they did not remember him specifically. Given daily volume, this was expected. Memory decay affected staff as well as visitors. Shift schedules changed. Rangers rotated assignments. Temporary staff departed. By early December, even those who might have crossed paths with Fugate struggled to isolate him from other visitors. Descriptions blurred. Certainty weakened. One ranger later recalled a man asking a general question about old roads or backways sometime that week. The ranger could not recall the exact phrasing. He could not confirm the date. No written note had been made. The recollection surfaced only after Fugate's disappearance became known and was never formalized. Such fragments are common in missing person cases. They float at the edge of awareness. Without documentation, they remain anecdotal. Official investigations rely on statements that can be dated, sourced, and verified. Informal memory does not meet that standard. Another unrecorded observation involved vehicle timing. A maintenance worker believed the white Ford Taurus arrived later in the day than most vehicles on November 26. The impression was based on routine patterns rather than precise memory. The license plate was not noted, the observation was not logged. These impressions never aligned into a coherent timeline. Each stood alone. Without corroboration, they carried little weight. Investigators could not place them relative to one another. As a result, they were excluded from formal analysis. As years passed, additional claims appeared in online discussions. Some individuals stated they remembered seeing Fugate walking near service roads or utility paths. Others suggested he had spoken casually with park staff about photography locations. None of these accounts included dates, names, or corroborating detail. Park officials treated such claims as unverified. Without identifiers or documentation, they could not be evaluated. They were not added to the case file. The official narrative remained unchanged. The lack of early witness documentation had a compounding effect. Without a baseline of observed movement, later analysis relied almost entirely on physical evidence. When that evidence remained static, interpretation stalled. In some missing person cases, late emerging witnesses prompt renewed searches or revised theories. In Fugate's case, no account reached the threshold required to reopen operations. Memories surfaced too late and without precision. Another factor shaping silence was perception of authority. Visitors often assume rangers are observant and omnipresent. This belief discourages reporting. A person may assume that if something unusual mattered, staff would already be aware. Rangers, in turn, depend on reports to flag anomalies. When none arrive, conditions are interpreted as normal. This mutual expectation creates blind spots where events pass unnoticed by design. What little documentation existed focused on absence. Logs recorded that Fugate was not present at his campsite. They did not record who was present nearby, what movements occurred, or how the campground changed over time. The record described what was missing, not what was seen. This negative framing narrowed interpretive range. It created a vacuum where activity should have been. Later reviewers encountered a clean surface. No conflicting statements, no contradictions, no narrative to reconstruct. Years later, journalists and researchers attempting to understand the case encountered these gaps. Witnesses could not be located. Staff memories had faded. Files contained no descriptive accounts. The disappearance appeared abrupt and unexplained. The Park Service has stated that all relevant witness information was considered at the time. Within procedural boundaries, this statement is accurate. Information that was never recorded could not be weighed or revisited. This points to a structural limitation. In transient environments, reliance on formal reporting often misses context. By the time relevance is recognized, the human record has already dissolved. In Fugate's case, no witness account indicated immediate danger. That absence was interpreted as reassurance. Safety was inferred from silence. The conclusion followed the documentation rather than the environment. What was not recorded became effectively non-existent. Conversations held casually, brief sightings at dusk, questions asked without urgency. These moments vanished without trace. The case file reflects order. It lacks conflict. This order suggests certainty, but it is built on omission rather than resolution. Witnesses were present. Their observations existed briefly. They were not captured. Paul Fugate's disappearance unfolded across terrain, but it also unfolded across time. Each unasked question narrowed the possible paths. Each unwritten note closed a line of inquiry. What remains is a procedural quiet, not deliberate secrecy, but the silence of moments that passed without recognition. That silence now stands alongside the desert as one of the defining features of the case. The role of environmental explanation. From the earliest moments of the investigation, the landscape itself was positioned as the primary explanation for Paul Fugate's disappearance. Death Valley carried its own narrative long before his arrival. Extreme heat, immense scale, and deceptive openness were already embedded in public understanding. When other explanations failed to take shape, the environment did not need to be proven. It was already accepted. Death Valley National Park spans more than 3 million acres. To the casual observer, much of it appears flat and readable. Long horizons suggest openness. Roads cut straight lines through basins. The ground looks firm. This impression is misleading. Elevation changes occur gradually and without visual cues. Salt flats fracture into uneven crust. Washes carve shallow channels that only become visible once entered. A person can walk with confidence and lose orientation without realizing it. Park officials return to these characteristics repeatedly when discussing Fugate's case. Visitors underestimate distance. The scale overwhelms perception. Direction becomes uncertain without landmarks. These statements are accurate. They also apply broadly, making them useful as explanation in nearly any disappearance within the park. Seasonal conditions were also emphasized. Late November does not bring the extreme heat associated with summer fatalities, but environmental risk remains. Daytime temperatures may feel manageable. Nights cool rapidly. Wind increases after sunset. Exposure becomes a cumulative process rather than an immediate crisis. This allowed environmental danger to remain plausible without invoking extraordinary circumstances. In internal summaries, exposure was described as gradual and predictable. A visitor walks farther than planned. Fatigue accumulates. Orientation falters. Water consumption is delayed. Cognitive clarity diminishes. Movement slows. Eventually, the person stops moving. This sequence appears in documented desert survival cases and carries institutional weight. What complicates Fugate's disappearance is preparation. His water remained in the vehicle. Food was untouched. No supplies were missing. The car showed no signs of staged departure. In many exposure cases, individuals take water or gear before leaving their vehicle, even briefly. Fugate did not. This inconsistency was acknowledged but minimized. Environmental explanation does not depend on perfect alignment. It relies on probability rather than reconstruction. The desert is unforgiving. People make unexpected choices. Absence of remains reinforces the narrative rather than challenging it. Officials referenced Death Valley's historical recovery record. Over decades, individuals have vanished without trace. Some were located years later, far from last known points. Others were never found. These outcomes were cited as precedent. Fugate's disappearance fit within that statistical context. Yet deserts do not erase everything uniformly. Objects persist. Clothing degrades slowly. Equipment often remains visible for years. In Fugate's case, nothing surfaced. No clothing fragments. No tools. No personal items. Multiple seasons passed without secondary discovery. Environmental explanation accounts for decomposition and scavenging, but it does not fully address total absence. This gap was noted internally. It did not alter classification. The explanation remained sufficient. Search strategy was shaped by environmental assumptions. Models prioritized linear movement away from the vehicle. probability zones focused on nearby washes and open flats. Areas requiring intentional deviation, such as service corridors or administratively controlled zones, were deprioritized. The environment did not only explain the disappearance, it guided how the search was conducted. Auditory isolation was another factor emphasized. Sound dissipates quickly in desert basins. A call for help may not travel far. This reduces the likelihood of witnesses and reinforces the absence of reports as expected rather than concerning. Visual isolation followed the same logic. From ground level, sightlines are short. Low rises block view. A person can vanish from sight within minutes, even near developed areas. This supported the idea that Fugate could have moved unseen without leaving trace. Together, these characteristics formed a self-contained explanation. The environment was treated as both cause and obstacle. It explained disappearance while also explaining why no evidence was found. Over time, this framing hardened. Early documents described exposure as possible. Later correspondence described the disappearance as consistent with exposure. The language shifted from hypothesis to expectation without new information. Environmental explanation also served administrative needs. It closed inquiry without assigning fault. No procedural failure, no misconduct, no unresolved decision. The desert simply functioned as it always had. Alternative hypotheses were quietly sidelined. Third-party involvement lacked evidence. Accidental injury near infrastructure was deemed unlikely. Voluntary disappearance was briefly considered and then dismissed. Exposure remained the most neutral outcome. Neutrality, however, does not equal completeness. Environmental explanation describes what could happen, not what did happen. In Fugate's case, no sequence was confirmed, no path was identified, no moment was located. The landscape filled the narrative gap left by missing information. Families often struggle with this form of explanation. It offers no coordinates, no time, no clarity. It replaces specificity with scale. Officials acknowledged this difficulty while maintaining the position. Comparisons were frequently made to hikers, discovered years later in unexpected locations. These examples suggested that absence does not imply proximity. Fugate could be anywhere. This possibility justified both restraint and patience. Environmental explanation also absorbs procedural delay. Early inaction becomes less relevant if survival odds are assumed to diminish rapidly regardless. The first hours matter less when the environment is framed as overwhelming from the outset. This logic is persuasive. It is also circular. Because the environment is dangerous, searches are limited. Because searches are limited, outcomes remain unknown. Unknown outcomes reinforce the perception of environmental danger. In Fugate's case, this cycle established itself quickly. By early December, exposure was the dominant narrative. Subsequent information was filtered through that assumption. The desert neither confirmed nor contradicted the explanation. It offered no evidence. It remained silent. Over the years, visitors continued to ask about disappearances. Rangers repeated the same cautions. Carry water, stay on trails, respect distance. Fugate's case became an implicit lesson rather than an active question. Environmental explanation transforms individual loss into general warning. It removes personal detail. It turns a person into a statistic shaped by terrain. Paul Fugate entered Death Valley with intentions, routines, and expectations. He exited the record as an outcome attributed to geography. The desert is capable of disappearance. That is not disputed. What remains unresolved is whether it acted alone. Environmental explanation answered enough questions to allow closure. It did not answer all of them. Institutional incentives and risk management. When a disappearance moves beyond the field and into administration, different forces begin to shape how it is handled. These forces are rarely visible. They do not appear in incident summaries or search logs. They operate quietly, influencing which explanations are favoured and which lines of inquiry fade. In Paul Fugate's case, institutional incentives and risk management considerations formed an unseen framework around the investigation. National parks operate under layered responsibility. They are public spaces, federal workplaces, and managed environments. Every decision carries implications beyond the immediate incident. Safety, liability, staffing, budget, and public perception all intersect. When a case lacks clear evidence, these factors gain influence. One of the strongest incentives is risk containment. A disappearance framed as environmental exposure carries minimal institutional risk. The park is dangerous by nature. Visitors are warned repeatedly. Responsibility is diffuse. No single decision appears causal. This framing protects the agency from legal and reputational vulnerability. By contrast, alternative explanations introduce complexity. If a disappearance involves procedural error, restricted areas, staff interaction, or delayed response, responsibility becomes traceable. Traceability invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites review. Review consumes resources and exposes uncertainty. In Fugate's case, environmental explanation required no escalation. It aligned with existing warnings and educational messaging. It fit public expectations. Death Valley is known to be unforgiving. The explanation felt complete, even without specifics. Risk management also shaped how information was released. Transparency carries its own risks. Partial records invite interpretation. Gaps invite speculation. From an administrative perspective, controlled disclosure reduces uncertainty. Fewer details mean fewer questions. This approach does not require secrecy. It requires selectivity. Information is shared at a level sufficient to meet procedural obligations without expanding inquiry. Fugate's case followed this pattern. Summaries were provided, detailed logs were withheld, explanations were broad. Another incentive involves precedent. How one case is handled influences future cases. If an agency reopens investigations without new evidence, it sets an expectation. Families of other missing persons may request similar action. Resources may be stretched. Consistency becomes harder to maintain. In this context, closure becomes a management goal. Closure does not require resolution. It requires stability. A case classified as unresolved due to environmental factors can remain dormant indefinitely without contradicting policy. Staffing considerations also play a role. Search and investigation require personnel diversion. Overtime accumulates. Routine operations are disrupted. In large parks with limited staff, prolonged cases create strain. Risk management favors proportional response. Public perception further influences decisions. High-profile disappearances can alter visitor behavior. They can generate fear or mistrust. Framing incidents as rare and environmentally driven reassures the public. It reinforces the idea that safety lies in compliance with guidance rather than institutional oversight. In Fugate's case, the absence of media attention reduced external pressure. Without sustained coverage, internal incentives favored quiet management. The case did not demand public narrative beyond standard cautionary messaging. Liability concerns also shape explanation. If a disappearance is linked to infrastructure failure, unclear signage, or restricted area access, liability questions emerge. Environmental exposure shifts responsibility toward personal choice and natural conditions. Risk management frameworks often prioritize defensibility. An explanation that is widely accepted and difficult to disprove is defensible. Environmental exposure meets that criterion. It does not require proof of sequence. It rests on plausibility. This defensibility affects internal communication. Staff are guided toward consistent language. Phrases like consistent with exposure or no evidence of foul play appear across cases. Consistency reduces risk of contradiction. Over time, this language becomes habitual. It is applied even when specifics differ. Fugate's case fit within an established template. The template did not need modification. Institutional memory also factors in. As staff rotate and retire, cases lose advocates. Without someone invested in reopening questions, inertia prevails. Risk management favors maintaining existing classification rather than reassessing past decisions. Training materials reinforce this orientation. Missing person scenarios emphasize prevention and early response rather than retrospective analysis. Past cases are referenced abstractly. Individual narratives fade. From an institutional perspective, uncertainty is manageable when it remains abstract. Specific uncertainty demands action. Environmental explanation keeps uncertainty diffuse. Families experience this differently. They seek specificity. They want timelines, locations, decisions. Risk management logic does not prioritize these needs unless required by policy or law. In Fugate's case, no external mandate forced deeper review, no court order, no congressional inquiry, no sustained media investigation. Without these triggers, institutional incentives favored maintenance over exploration. This does not imply malicious intent. Risk management is not conspiracy, it is routine. It operates through default choices and standard language. it shapes outcomes quietly. The result is a narrowing of acceptable explanations. Over time, exposure becomes not just the most likely outcome, but the only outcome considered. This narrowing affects how new information is interpreted. Any detail that aligns with environmental framing is absorbed. Details that do not are treated as anomalies without weight. Institutional incentives also discourage reopening cases because reopening implies earlier insufficiency. Admitting insufficiency creates risk. Maintaining consistency avoids it. In Fugate's case, the disappearance became administratively complete long before it was resolved. The system moved on while questions remained. Risk management ensures organizational stability. It does not ensure truth. The National Park Service is not unique in this regard. Large institutions prioritize continuity. They respond to uncertainty by reducing exposure, not expanding inquiry. Paul Fugate's case sits within that reality. The explanation chosen was not only about terrain, it was about manageability. Understanding this context does not assign blame. It explains behavior. It shows how systems respond when answers are unavailable. The disappearance was shaped not only by desert conditions, but by institutional logic. That logic remains invisible unless examined. Family efforts and unanswered requests. When official search operations ended, the disappearance did not conclude for Paul Fugate's family. It changed character. The focus moved away from desert ground and search grids and into letters, phone calls, and long periods of waiting. What followed was not an investigation in the traditional sense, but an extended attempt to understand decisions that had already been made, documented briefly, and then allowed to settle without review. In the first months after search activity was suspended, confusion shaped every interaction. The family struggled to interpret the language used by park officials. The search was described as paused, not terminated. Phrases such as pending new information, at this time, and, based on current evidence, suggested flexibility rather than finality. To the family, these words implied that further action might follow. Nothing in the early communication clearly indicated that the effort was effectively over. Paul Fugate's sister assumed the role of primary contact. She called the park regularly, asking for updates, clarification, and projected timelines. In the early weeks, conversations were patient and professional. Staff explained the size of Death Valley and noted that recoveries sometimes occurred long after disappearances. She was encouraged to remain hopeful but realistic, a balance that offered comfort without clarity. As weeks passed, the tone of communication shifted subtly. Phone calls were returned less consistently. Messages became shorter. Staff began referring back to earlier explanations instead of offering new information. The same phrases appeared repeatedly. Questions received identical responses. Without being told directly, the family sensed that the case had moved into a different administrative category. The family adjusted their approach. Instead of asking what might happen next, they began asking what had already happened. Formal requests focused on search operations, which areas were examined, how long teams remained in the field, what criteria guided expansion or suspension. The answers were broad and unspecific. High probability areas, nearby terrain, accessible zones. No maps were provided. No detailed breakdown of search coverage was shared. When the family asked why certain areas were not searched, the response relied on professional discretion. Officials stated that all reasonable areas had been examined. What constituted reasonable was not defined. The explanation rested on judgment rather than documentation, leaving the family without a way to evaluate the decision. Requests then shifted toward records. The family asked for ranger logs from the days surrounding the disappearance. Partial records were released. Names were redacted. Some entries were so brief they conveyed little information. Others referenced attachments or supplemental reports that were not included. When the family asked about those missing materials, no response followed. The undeveloped film found in Fugate's vehicle became a central point of concern. The family asked what the images showed. They asked whether the photographs included recognizable locations, other people, or signs of distress. Each request received the same answer. The film had been reviewed. It was not relevant. No further description was provided. This refusal marked a quiet turning point. The family no longer believed that all information was being shared. There was no confrontation and no accusation. Trust diminished gradually. The lack of explanation felt deliberate, even if it stemmed from policy rather than intent. Freedom of Information Act requests followed. These requests were formal and slow, Some were acknowledged promptly, others were delayed beyond expected timelines. When documents arrived, they often lacked context. Entire sections were redacted without explanation. Appeals produced only marginal additions. The process became a lesson in procedural endurance rather than discovery. The family contacted other agencies in search of assistance. Local law enforcement deferred to the National Park Service, citing jurisdiction. Federal offices confirmed that no criminal investigation was open. Without evidence of a crime, there was no transfer of authority. The case remained contained within the same administrative boundaries. They reached out to missing person advocacy organizations. These groups reviewed the available information and noted gaps in documentation and transparency. They offered guidance and emotional support, but had no authority to compel further action. Persistence, documentation, and patience were the only tools available. Years passed. Letters continued. Each letter was eventually answered. Each response repeated the same conclusions. No new evidence had emerged. The case remained unresolved. Environmental exposure remained the explanation. The emotional impact accumulated slowly. There was no single moment of closure, no confirmation of death, no physical location where grief could settle. The family lived in prolonged uncertainty, marked by cycles of hope, followed by silence. They asked whether advances in technology might justify renewed examination, improved satellite imagery, more detailed terrain modeling, new forensic methods. The responses were non-committal. Without new evidence, re-examination was not planned. Technological possibility alone was not considered sufficient. At times, officials suggested that remains might still be discovered by chance. Hikers occasionally find items decades later. This possibility was offered as reassurance. It also shifted responsibility away from active search and into the indefinite future. The family attempted to bring public attention to the case. They contacted journalists. Some expressed interest but struggled to frame the story. There was no confirmed wrongdoing, no dramatic incident. The environment itself dominated the narrative, leaving little space for investigation. Without sustained media pressure, institutional posture remained unchanged. The case did not move. Internally, the family maintained their own records, copies of letters, notes from phone calls, dates, names, and repeated phrases. Over time, these records became more detailed than the official file. They carried no authority. The family returned to the site. They walked the campground. They followed nearby paths. They looked into washes and dry channels. Their searches were informal, guided by intuition rather than probability models. They found nothing. These visits were difficult. The landscape appeared unchanged. The absence was complete. There was no sign that anything had occurred, no marker of interruption. At one point, the family asked whether restricted or controlled areas had been searched. The response was indirect. Searches were conducted in accordance with policy. No additional detail was offered. This answer reinforced a recurring pattern. Questions were acknowledged, but not engaged. The system responded without explanation. Over time, expectations adjusted. The family stopped asking when the search would resume. They began asking only for transparency. Even that proved difficult to obtain. The final letters they received were polite and conclusive in tone. The park expressed sympathy. It reiterated that no evidence of foul play existed. It confirmed that the case remained unresolved. No further action was proposed. For the institution, the matter was complete. For the family, it was not. Their efforts did not uncover new facts. They revealed boundaries, limits of procedure, limits of jurisdiction, limits of persistence. In disappearance cases, families often become investigators by necessity. They ask questions, others stop asking. They notice inconsistencies, others accept. Their role is not adversarial, it is unfinished. Paul Fugate's family did not accuse. They requested, they documented, they waited. What they encountered was not obstruction, but closure without explanation. The unanswered requests accumulated not because they were unreasonable, but because they exceeded what the system was designed to provide once a case was classified and set aside. The family learned that absence does not compel action. It invites explanation. Once explanation is accepted, inquiry slows. Eventually, correspondence ended, not because questions were answered, but because no new avenues remained. Paul Fugate remained missing. His family remained present. What endured was not resolution. The case did not end with discovery or conclusion. It settled into administrative stillness, held there by policy, precedent, and time. For the family, that stillness was not peace, it was suspension. And it continues, the absence that refused to resolve. As years passed, Paul Fugate's disappearance settled into a strange category. It was not an active investigation, yet it was not closed. It existed in records, databases, and archived correspondence, marked unresolved, but no longer examined. This state created a different kind of absence, one that persisted without movement or expectation. In official terms, the case required nothing further. It had been searched, it had been documented, it had been explained through environmental probability. There were no outstanding actions assigned, no follow-up dates scheduled, no internal prompts for review. The system had completed its role. Yet unresolved cases do not remain static in human experience. They change slowly as context shifts. What once felt current becomes historical. Personnel retire, policies update, institutional memory thins. Over time, the disappearance of Paul Fugate became less a recent event and more a reference point. Within the National Park Service, the case existed as an entry rather than a narrative, a name, a date, a location, a classification. New staff encountering it would see only summary language. Environmental exposure, no evidence of foul play, search suspended. Without detail, the case appeared settled. This transformation altered how questions were received. Early inquiries were met with explanation. Later inquiries were met with repetition. Eventually, they were met with silence or deferral. The passage of time changed expectations on both sides. For the family, time did not soften the absence, it sharpened it. Each year without information narrowed possibilities while expanding uncertainty. The lack of new evidence did not confirm conclusions, it simply reinforced that no mechanism remained to challenge them. At a certain point, the family recognized that the case would not move forward unless something external intervened. A discovery, a confession, a documented error. Without one of these, the administrative posture would remain unchanged. They learned that unresolved does not mean open, it means inactive. This distinction matters. Open cases invite attention. Inactive cases persist quietly. They are not reviewed unless triggered. They are not questioned unless forced. They remain as they are. Paul Fugate's disappearance reached this state early. Once classified as environmental exposure, it no longer generated internal urgency. The explanation absorbed uncertainty. It reduced the need for follow-up. Over time, even requests for transparency diminished. The family understood what responses would contain. Repetition replaced dialogue. Eventually, correspondence slowed and stopped. Not because answers were found, but because the process itself yielded nothing new. The absence also affected how the case appeared to outsiders. Researchers encountering it years later saw limited documentation. They saw no contradiction. They saw no unresolved procedural questions. The case appeared clean. This cleanliness was misleading. It was not the result of clarity, but of compression. Complexity had been reduced to summary. Detail had been removed through omission rather than resolution. In disappearance cases, this reduction often becomes the final form. The longer a case remains inactive, the less likely it is to be revisited. Institutional systems favor forward movement. Backward examination carries little incentive. The desert itself reinforced this stillness. Death Valley changes slowly. Landscapes erode gradually. What is not found early becomes harder to find later. Each passing year reduces the likelihood of discovery. Officials occasionally acknowledged this reality. They noted that recoveries sometimes occurred decades later, but they did not propose proactive action. Discovery was framed as chance rather than effort. This framing shifted the burden of resolution away from institutions and toward time. Time might reveal something, or it might not. Either outcome required no intervention. For the family, this was the most difficult realization, that the disappearance had become something no one was actively trying to resolve. They revisited the question of whether anything had been missed early on, whether faster action, broader search, or different assumptions might have changed the outcome. These questions had no official forum. They existed only privately. In the absence of answers, the family reconstructed the timeline themselves. They examined what was known, they compared it to other cases, they looked for deviation. What they found was not evidence of wrongdoing, but of limitation. The system had operated as designed. That design prioritized efficiency, defensibility, and closure. It did not prioritize lingering uncertainty. This realization reframed the disappearance. It was no longer only about what happened to Paul Fugate. It was also about how systems respond when outcomes resist explanation. Unresolved cases challenge institutional comfort. They expose the limits of procedure. They require acknowledgement of uncertainty. Many systems respond by minimizing that discomfort. Paul Fugate's case became an example of that response, not through concealment or intent, but through routine. The absence persisted without escalation, without review, without narrative correction. Years later, the case remained unchanged in official records. The same language, the same classification, the same absence of detail. The family remained aware of this stasis. They did not expect resolution. They expected acknowledgement. Even that proved difficult. The disappearance did not fade. It became a fixed point around which time moved. In public spaces, Death Valley continued to welcome visitors. Rangers continued to warn about distance and water. The park functioned as always. Fugate's case existed only as an internal reference. The absence refused to resolve, not because it was unsolvable, but because it was no longer examined. This is the final form of many disappearances. Not mystery, but inertia. Paul Fugate did not become a recovered case. He did not become a confirmed death. He became an unresolved entry maintained by habit. For the family, this state was neither closure nor peace. It was suspension without expectation of change. The desert did not answer. The institution did not revisit. Time did not clarify. What remained was absence, stabilized by procedure. And it remains, the question that would not settle. As the years accumulated, Paul Fugate's disappearance took on a different quality. It was no longer anchored to a specific moment or decision. It became diffuse, spread across time, policy, memory, and absence. The question was no longer only where he went or what happened, but why nothing around the case ever changed. In official records, the disappearance remained static. The classification did not shift. The language stayed consistent. Environmental exposure, no evidence of foul play. Search suspended. This stability suggested resolution, even though no answer existed. The system treated the absence as complete. Outside those records, the question persisted in quieter ways. It surfaced in conversations with park visitors who asked about disappearances. It appeared in online forums where unresolved cases were catalogued. It emerged in private reflection, where the lack of explanation continued to feel incomplete. Unresolved cases often develop this dual existence. Administratively, they are finished. Socially and personally, they are unfinished. The gap between these two states becomes the defining feature. In Fugate's case, that gap widened over time. The longer the case remained inactive, the more difficult it became to reopen. Documentation aged. Personnel changed. Context faded. The absence of new evidence became indistinguishable from confirmation of earlier assumptions. Institutional systems are not designed to hold questions indefinitely. They are designed to move forward. When movement is impossible, systems reduce complexity. They summarize, they archive, they maintain only what is necessary to preserve consistency. This process does not require intention. It occurs through routine maintenance. Files are compressed, language is standardized, exceptions are removed. Over time, what remains is not a full account, but a stable one. The question that would not settle existed outside that stability. It was carried by those who could not accept explanation without detail. It was carried by the family, but also by others who encountered the case and noticed its sparseness. Researchers who reviewed the case years later often remarked on what was missing rather than what was present. There was no clear last sighting, no confirmed direction of travel, no recovered item beyond the vehicle. The absence of secondary evidence stood out. In many disappearance cases, later discoveries introduced new complexity. A shoe, a scrap of fabric, a partial bone. These items do not resolve the case, but they change it. They reopen questions. Fugate's case did not receive this interruption. The desert did not return anything. Wind and erosion did their work without revealing detail. Time passed without incident. Each season that ended without discovery reinforced the sense that nothing more would emerge. This absence influenced how the case was perceived. Without new material, there was nothing to analyze. Without analysis, there was nothing to debate. The case became unremarkable through repetition. The lack of contradiction played a role. Official explanation was not challenged by evidence. It also was not supported by evidence. It simply persisted. In institutional terms, persistence often substitutes for verification. The question that would not settle lingered precisely because it could not be tested. There was no site to examine, no remains to analyze, no event to reconstruct. The case existed as a narrative placeholder. For the family, This meant that the disappearance never transitioned into memory. Memory requires shape. It requires a sequence. Without that, the event remains present rather than past. This state affected how time was experienced. Anniversaries passed without markers. There was no date of death. There was no location to visit. The absence remained current. Occasionally, the family revisited the possibility that something simple had been overlooked, a wrong assumption early on, a missed area, a misinterpreted detail. These possibilities could not be tested without reopening the case. Reopening required justification. Justification required evidence. Evidence required discovery. Discovery required search. The cycle remained closed. This circularity is common in unresolved cases. Once a case reaches a certain age without new information, it becomes increasingly difficult to disturb, not because it is solved, but because it has settled into administrative equilibrium. The Park Service did not deny the existence of questions. It acknowledged uncertainty in broad terms. It did not invite re-examination. The difference between acknowledging uncertainty and acting on it remained significant. Over time, the case began to function symbolically. It represented the limits of search, the scale of the environment, the unpredictability of wilderness. These themes appeared in safety messaging and training contexts. In this form, Fugate's disappearance became a lesson rather than an inquiry. Lessons do not require resolution, they require repetition. This transformation further reduced the chance of reassessment. Once a case is used to illustrate general risk, it is less likely to be examined for specific cause. The question that would not settle persisted outside that framework. It asked not what wilderness can do, but what was done in response. That question had no clear audience. Institutions had moved on, media interest had faded, public attention was elsewhere. The question existed without a forum. In some cases, unresolved disappearances are eventually reframed through discovery elsewhere. A body found far from the original site, a record uncovered, a confession unrelated to the original investigation. Fugate's case did not receive such reframing. The absence of reframing reinforced the original explanation by default. Over time, default becomes accepted. The question remained because acceptance did not feel complete. Acceptance without understanding creates tension. That tension does not dissipate. It becomes background. For those who carried it, the question became less about outcome and more about process. How decisions were made, how they were communicated, how they were allowed to stand without review. This shift mattered. It moved the focus from speculation about events to examination of systems. Systems do not disappear, they persist. Paul Fugate's disappearance illuminated how systems handle uncertainty, not through malice or concealment, but through normalization. The question that would not settle remained unanswered because it no longer fit within active categories. It was not new, it was not urgent, it was not actionable, yet it continued to exist. Unresolved cases often end not with answers, but with endurance. They persist quietly, carried by those unwilling or unable to let them dissolve into summary. Fugate's case reached this state early and remained there. It was not dramatic, it was not volatile, it was steady. The question did not demand resolution. It resisted it. In the absence of evidence, absence itself became the defining element. Not absence of a person, but absence of movement within the case. The desert remained unchanged. The records remained unchanged. The explanation remained unchanged. What remained unsettled was not the conclusion, but the silence surrounding it. And that silence continues to hold the question in place. Cases like this rarely end with certainty. They end with paperwork, assumptions, and time. Paul Fugate's disappearance remains unresolved, not because every answer was found, but because the search for answers stopped. If you want more long-form investigations like this, stories shaped by records, silence, and what remains unexplained, subscribe to the channel. Share this video if you think these cases deserve continued attention. And if you have thoughts, questions, or information worth considering, leave a comment below. Some stories only stay buried because no one keeps asking.